Hello, everyone, and welcome back for another episode of the Outdoor Adventure Series podcast. The Outdoor Adventure Series celebrates individuals and families, businesses, and organizations that seek out and promote the exploration, stewardship, conservation, access, and enjoyment of the great outdoors. Our guest today is Scott Kovarovics. Scott is the Executive Director of the Izaak Walton League of America. The league is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year and is one of America's oldest and most successful conservation organizations. The league has carved out a unique role promoting hands-on conservation and citizen science while advocating for strong state and national policies to protect our air, water, and wildlife. Scott, it's a pleasure to have you on the Outdoor Adventure Series podcast. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Really appreciate the opportunity to join you today. Thanks.
Fantastic. And for our listeners, I had the pleasure of learning more about the Izaak Walton League of America this past month. Actually, God, we're in June, so it would have been May last month at the Outdoor Writers Association of America's conference in Casper, Wyoming. A representative from the Izaak Walton League was there. We were having dinner together. And as I was hearing about the league in more detail, he actually handed me a couple magazines. So, Scott, I love the fact that your guys are carrying their collateral around. What a phenomenal organization. And I just knew I needed to get someone, now you, onto the podcast. And really, for our listeners, Scott, if you could share a little bit about yourself first, because I always like to kind of hear the why and about my guest. And then let's talk about the Izaak Walton League of America.
Sure. Happy to do it. So I came to the league in 2008 as the conservation director. So I was supervising our conservation programs and doing most of our public policy lobbying. And I became executive director in 2013 and have had that role since. And for me, to a large degree, coming to work the league was kind of a blend of my professional experience and my kind of youth really growing up. I grew up hunting, fishing, a lot of target shooting as a kid. And I got away from that when I went to school, went to college in Washington, D.C., and it kind of got lost that a little bit, the access and so forth. And then I was working in the Congress and doing a lot of work on environmental policy, public land management. My boss was a member of, sat on the House Interior Committee. And so I was doing the policy work that related to conservation, environmental protection, public land management. So for the league, it kind of brought those things together for the lobbying on the policy issues that I do. And for me, more personally, the connection with the organization and with so many of our members around outdoor recreation, whether that be fishing or canoeing or hiking or participating in shooting sports, which is usually popular among our members.
Okay. Now, I'd like to circle back a little bit and unpack some more about your background. When you went to school, were you studying public policy, public administration? What was the area of education?
Yeah, I got my bachelor's degree in political science, and I was really interested in the Congress, and I was doing internships there and got to work. My first job was a receptionist in the district office in Norwich, Connecticut, working for Congressman Sam Gadenson, who represented Eastern Connecticut for 20 years in the House. Great guy. And, as I said, he was a member of the House Interior Committee, and I did the committee work, for him. And that was really the substantive work on, frankly, on the policies in many cases that the Izaak Walton League helped to really put into effect in the 20th century.
Okay. I have to share in the spirit of full disclosure. I have a couple of those every once in a while on my shows, but I came this close. And so for our listeners, when you see the YouTube video, my fingers are like within a millimeter of each other of being an intern, or actually not an intern, but actually working for a congressman back where I grew up in the Detroit suburbs. And for whatever reason, they just decided not to fill the role, but I came that close. And I just loved, as I was growing up, being able to go to Washington. It's like, I want to work here. And so you've done it. So like, good for you.
That was my passion for the longest time. And really, just a really important experience for me. It's something that, I'm fortunate to have been able to do and play a tiny little part in some of the work that my boss did, including for conservation and throughout Eastern Connecticut during the time that he was in office.
Sure. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, the league has been around for now 100 years. They're celebrating their 100-year anniversary. this year. That leak, therefore, has predated us by, I think, quite a few years. As you were growing up, had you always been an outdoor enthusiast? Did you grow up going out with the family or aunts and uncles, parents, camping, hiking, fishing, those types of activities?
Yeah. I think I was very much in the generation, and maybe the last generation of Americans, where you went outside after school or the first thing in the morning on Saturday and you came home when mom or dad called you for dinner. We lived on a relatively, I grew up in a little tiny town in northeastern Connecticut, but we lived on a kind of a common suburban street. Huge amount of woods out in the back that was not necessarily ours, but we ranged across it forever. Really, that time just kind of playing outside in the woods. Later on, I was in eighth, ninth grade in high school and then on, was I got much more involved in hunting and fishing and target shooting, which I probably spent more time doing than maybe some of those other activities. Family, not so much. It was just one of those things I did with friends or did on my own. Now with our own family, my kids are in college now, but growing up, I think more of that, we kind of organized, we went out hiking and things like that. But it was part of what I did. I worked on a dairy farm in high school and college to help pay the bills. And that was another time where I really enjoyed just being outside. And that was kind of, just part of the DNA, I guess.
Sure. The dairy farm, I would think, is definitely a eye opener when it comes to being a producer. There's a product that has to be produced, but there's also stewardship of the land that comes into play as well, because the cows need a place to graze and a healthy ecosystem is so important. Let's talk a little bit about the Izaak Walton League. Again, 100 years. How did it come about? Because before you answer that, I do want to share full disclosure here. I know the Izaak Walton League because of the Outdoor Writers Association of America. I know their 100th year is like around the corner. It's so it was started as a result of a bunch of writers, journalists going to one of the meetings in Chicago. Except for that connection there, have never heard of the Izaak Walton League. And when I see all the work that you're doing, it's like, wow, where were you when I was growing up? And you were there. So tell us more about it and why we should be learning more about it, especially in this day and age with our environment.
We often, Howard, we kind of joke internally that the Izaak Walton League's the best kept secret in conservation. And in some cases we chuckle, and in other cases we lament that as well. And I think that's very much the case. In your case is a perfect example. Mine too. If you didn't grow up in a community where there was a chapter, right, you probably didn't hear of the organization because it didn't have that same kind of national profile as some other organizations did. In communities where there were chapters, it was a much higher profile. And so the organization, kind of the origin story of the organization is Will Dill was an advertising executive in Chicago and a passionate angler and conservationist, and I think we would say today, to some degree, an environmentalist. And he had a network of friends, from writers to business owners, fishermen, average guys. And he sent them an invitation to lunch for a January day in 1922. And 54 of those people showed up at that meeting. And at that meeting, they agreed on the spot to form an organization to protect the nation's woods, waters, and wildlife. And really, the causes that drove these guys were concerns about what was happening to the environment all around them. We look today around at the environment in general. What we see to the naked eye is relatively decent, right? Compared to what you saw in the 1920s, in 1969, when rivers were literally on fire in America.
Sure.
That type of wanted destruction, the visceral pollution. I grew up in northeastern Connecticut. I never saw it myself. Textile mill country. The grandparents would talk about how the river ran the color of the dye they were using at the mill that day. That type of pollution, wetland drainage. And of course, for sportsmen, for people who hunted and fished at that time, right? I mean, wildlife was in precipitous decline, right? We think about white-tailed deer and turkey today, and they're everywhere. Canada goose. At that point in time, if you saw a white-tailed deer in the 1920s, right, it was uncommon. Forget about turkeys and those types of things. So it was those things that really animated those early founders of the organization, that the concern and the passion for conservation in and of itself, but also this clear knowledge that a healthy environment was absolutely essential for the outdoor recreation they enjoy and that they desperately wanted to pass on to future generations to be able to enjoy like they had done. And so from there, Dill and this group, formed the organization and set it up and did incredible things almost from day one.
That's incredible. And when you were sharing the stories that you had heard about the mills, I grew up in the Detroit suburbs, and I remember, I never saw it, but stories of the Rouge River, which is southeast Michigan, like being one of the most polluted rivers in the country. And I guess we have our stories. As this organization is evolving, and in 100 years, I know there's going to be a lot of acknowledgments for the work they've done, but some of the landmark work that the league has done in promoting conservation and stewardship that people like me or our listeners perhaps wouldn't know about the Izaak Walton League, but now like, oh wow, they did this. That's so cool. Now I want to do it. Because the end goal, we want more folks to be aware of the Izaak Walton League. So what are some of those key pieces of legislation that the league has worked on?
Yeah. And that's what we want today to get people involved. And I think about a couple of things. As we look at the Izaak Walton League, and our sense of this is that the league was what was we think is really the first grassroots sportsmen's organization. There were other organizations of sportsmen like Boone and Crockett, for example, but they were had a relatively small number of folks who were connected to one another, right? You think about people like President Roosevelt and folks who were connected with him. And the league was more of a mass movement. And that was one of those things right out of the box. Mass grassroots mobilization for conservation on the ground. What we now call, or what later became known as citizen science, was what they were doing from the very beginning. And it's incredible to read the early issues of the magazine. I'll give you one example. So at that point in time, bass, large and smallmouth bass, which today we think, they're everywhere, they survive everything, were teetering on the brink. And one of the things the league did early on was it urged every Ike everywhere in America, through its magazine in particular, to send a request to the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries for bass fry. They put fish in a barrel, literally, put it on a train and send it to the nearest train station. Guys would go get it from the train station and stock it in the nearest water they could find. And coupled with that, the Lacey Act that was passed in the very early 1900s had largely restricted the commercial sale of wildlife, which was one of the reasons it was kind of driving wildlife to the brink of extinction. We've heard about the kind of mass killing of passenger pigeons and ducks and things like that. But bass, for one reason or another, had kind of got through a loophole. So you marry that up with legislation to amend the Lacey Act to add bass to that list of fish and wildlife for which you couldn't have the commercial transportation. When you think about legislation, again, right out of the box, this was an organization, a group of people who had ambitious goals from day one. By 1924, 2 years after the organization was even formed, Congress passed the Upper Mississippi River National Wildlife and Fish Refuge at the urging of the League. This is a refuge today that extends about 250 miles along the shores of the Mississippi River from Minnesota and Wisconsin in the north down to Iowa and Illinois in the south. And it was really, they were wildlife refuges, but you think about a multi-state wildlife refuge. That wasn't really common at that point in time. You take the kind of the arc forward to the 1950s and 1960s, I think a seminal period in conservation policy making in this country, continuing through the 1970s. And the League's conservation director at the time, a very unassuming gentleman named Joe Penfold, was at the center of so much of that policy making. And I'll give you and your listeners just one example. The Land and Water Conservation Fund. Today, something that many consider among the most consequential conservation, environment, and outdoor recreation piece of legislation ever enacted was largely Penfold's idea. He had this idea of how do we take some of the revenue from using natural resources, which was largely drilling for oil and gas on public lands, and reinvest some of that to conserve natural resources elsewhere and to provide opportunities for more people to enjoy outdoor recreation. Here we have this post-war boom, right? Population boom, GIs back, people flooding the public lands, and the public lands couldn't handle it, right? Just didn't have the infrastructure. And so Penfold had this idea. The Congress created a special commission, presidential commission to look at outdoor recreation. And from that emerged these seminal laws, like the Land and Water Conservation Fund, the Wilderness Act, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And we see the impact of something like the Land and Water Conservation Fund today, the enduring impact. Conservation in capital NP national parks and national forests, and funding for basic outdoor recreation facilities, baseball fields, playgrounds, other facilities in nearly every county in the United States over that period of time. And so those are some of the things, when I could go on at length, but those are some of the examples. And I think they kind of come to the heart of the organization from this kind of grassroots movement where every person can make a positive impact, right? And together, when you add those up, when you aggregate those, the impacts are much more significant. The importance of policymaking and policy advocacy, and we see that throughout the course of the organization's history, and then certainly connecting people to the outdoors and to conservation through our chapter network across the country.
Perfect, perfect. And you were actually just hit on my next segue. These chapter networks. I mean, the league. You have a budget. You have a leadership. You're the executive director. There's a staff, but you rely on chapters and volunteers in those chapters. Talk to us a little bit about the chapter network. By the way, I was looking at a map. If I was going to join the league, by Scott, I have to go to California for that, or Colorado. I live in Southern Nevada. We have our own challenges here, by the way. Lake Mead is like disappearing before our eyes. But talk to us a little bit about the chapter network and what is their role? What are they doing locally to, again, to share and spread this message of the Izaak Walton League?
Yeah, I think we say this, and it's something that we believe, and I believe very, very fundamentally. Our members and chapters are the heart and soul of this organization. They have been from the very, very beginning. And our chapter network today is a little smaller than it was in those early years. The growth was just amazing in that first decade. Along came the Depression, Second World War, and various other things. But really, the chapters are the place where that connection happens locally, right? People are looking for opportunities to get outdoors, right? But first they're looking close to home. That's what our chapters provide, whether it's to take a walk in the woods with your family, to enjoy a day fishing, to get involved in target shooting from something that's super, super simple to very complex and intense competition. And also the opportunity to get involved in simple conservation projects in your own community. Everything from stream cleanups, roadside cleanups, to just simple restoration programs. You've got an invasive plant and animal problem in this country that really is driving native species to extinction.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
costing the economy tens of billions of dollars a year. And you've got folks getting involved in what can they do in their own community, as part of the effort for conservation. That's really the role that our chapters play, that nexus at the community level for folks to either enjoy outdoor recreation, get involved in conservation, or both.
The impact is continuing to happen from the organizations like the Izaak Walton League. And many of the landmark legislations, these acts that you had shared earlier, I would imagine, the big acts, the ones that had a lot of visibility, wildlife, air, water, nature, get out to nature, those they still needed to be stewarded and protected and advanced. But I would imagine some of the changes, and maybe this is where the message really needs to be worked on, perhaps. I don't know, that the changes that we need to continue to make perhaps are more subtle because there's a lot of things going on that we just don't see. We know it's a problem, but I can't see it, touch it, feel it, but I know it's a problem. How does the league address those types of issues that, again, they're here with us today?
Yeah, it's a really good point. When you think about water pollution today, it's a perfect example of that. right? A generation or two ago or before, right? It was pollution from a pipe pretty much, right? It was, that was what drove in large part passage of the Clean Water Act in 1972, which really was a culmination of 40 years of work of our organization, along with others, to provide that federal framework to improve water quality, to invest in sewage treatment, to set some basic standards to protect public health. And to a large degree today, that problem is in check, highly regulated, permitted, and a lot of focus on that. The greatest threat to water pollution today, according to the US EPA, is polluted runoff, running off unchecked, untreated from backyards, farm field, golf course, parking lots, you name it. That's what's polluting our water today. And you're right, it's harder to see. And one of the things we try to do to kind of bring that more to the fore is try to get more folks involved in citizen science. Getting out there with us, we help them do basic water quality testing and monitoring. How healthy are the waters? What pollutants might be in those waters? Do you have, the type of simple aquatic life that you would expect to find in healthy streams, healthy rivers across the country? And that's often the most powerful way to bring these issues to the fore. And there's other things, you think about soil health, right? Things that most of us don't think about, you don't see, but as a huge issue across the country, right? We're losing topsoil at an alarming rate. The nutrients in the soil has been depleted. And in order to make up for that, you put more chemicals on in order to try to grow that next year's crop. And that's just fueling this problem. And steps that you could take to improve soil health, reduce water pollution, and in the end, have a more sustainable and healthy food supply. So you're right. In today's day and age, and I think this is one of the challenges we face, the environmental challenges we face are not as obvious as they once were, but they're just as, if not more serious. And certainly climate change is example number one of that, although most people are experiencing more directly, if nothing else, the heat effects than they had in the past. And certainly you and your part of the country are living that every day, as well as it was always a challenging environment out there, right? For water quality, water quantity has only become that much more challenging.
It's definitely that. How does the league collaborate with other organizations that perhaps there's some overlap, perhaps it's more tangential, but you're all focusing on the things that matter? How do you currently collaborate with those other organizations?
Yeah. We know we do a lot of our work in coalitions, whether that's formal coalitions, XYZ coalition, or whatever it may be, or even informally with various organizations. And we're a member of, one example, the American Wildlife Conservation Partners, which is an informal coalition of more than 40 hunting, angling, conservation groups formed more than 20 years ago for just that purpose. How do we find that, work together on those common goals, bring the resources of the various organizations together? Some have expertise in issue A or B. Some have more grassroots capability. Some are really effective on Capitol Hill, bringing all those pieces together to advance that shared, those shared goals. And I think for an organization like the League, we've got partners that kind of run on both sides, right? Not just in the kind of hunting, angling, sportsman kind of side, but also with other organizations that are more traditionally identified as focusing on environmental protection. For us, improving and protecting water quality is one of our most important priorities. And so there, we may be working with organizations that are focused more on that or have more of a public health background because those things are so important. But we're a relatively small organization and we are able through partnerships. And it's the same thing at the local level, right? I mean, whether our chapters are doing the same thing, right? They're partnering with other organizations in the community around shared goals to grow that volunteer pool. Every organization, almost, I mean, maybe you find some examples, but it's pretty hard, right? Are always struggling to grow that volunteer base. You've got your core of committed folks, but those folks are committed 10 times over, right? And so looking for how you kind of grow that volunteer base. And those are things you're seeing in that kind of coalition and partnership work that the organization is doing from the local level to the national level.
Okay. Now, next month, you are going to be convening in East Peoria, Illinois for your annual conference and celebrating no doubt the 100th anniversary. And by the way, I was looking on the website where the conference was, and it said East Peoria or Peoria. I was like, wait a minute, why do I know that? And it's like, I used to have a customer I used to travel to. I think it's Washington or East Washington, there, it's nearby. It was like a Ford dealer. I'm thinking, oh, that's cool. I can go visit Mike. In any case, I digress. What is going to take place at this multi-day meeting, bringing all the people together to celebrate?
Yeah, a couple things. First of all, we're going to celebrate the 100th anniversary and really enjoy that, and even be sweeter after being away from in-person meetings since 2019. We're going to really look to the future. This convention for us is I think a literal and figurative transition point from the first 100 years to the beginning of the next 100 years, and laying out our vision for the future of conservation and outdoor recreation in America. And we'll do some basic business. We'll elect officers. We've got a very, very bottom-up organization. And the organization, we have conservation policies that really guide our work nationally, locally, state advocacy, and all those policies are initiated and ultimately approved by members at annual conventions. Our members decide the organization's position on issue A, B, or C. And that was the guidance for me when I was a conservation director, the guidance for our staff, the guidance for our members if they're lobbying in Iowa, for example, or in Minnesota on issues. And so we'll debate those. Our members will debate those and agree to them. And that's kind of the basic, business. We'll have speakers on some of what we really think are the most important topics of the day to help us kind of not only look at what's happening now, but look going forward, and we'll have some fun too, with folks all across the country gathered together, chance to reconnect with friends, rekindle those great relationships, and enjoy some time together and celebrate, as what you said at the beginning is, and I don't say this being surprised, but what is a truly remarkable history for an organization, I think, of our size.
Fantastic. Now, I am curious, and I know I promised no gotcha questions, but you're an executive director. If you've worked for a congressman before, you're going to be able to handle this without a problem. You think about the folks who are going to be attending this meeting, and you've had a lot of conversations to get things up and running, plan the event. You have speakers. There's probably an award ceremony of some sort. Is there a story or two from one of your members that really communicates what the league is all about? Like, oh, wow, I'm so glad I'm a part of this organization and that I can do what I'm doing, not only for it in their chapter, but also know that I'm making a difference. Any story like that come to mind?
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is a story per se, but I think of folks who have been central to these meetings during my time and over a longer period of time, who are simply, what their focus was to go out and help people who they encountered understand, what is this organization, the Izaak Walton, right? I think of one guy in particular, Bob Stegmeyer from Michigan. He had a hat and a shirt, and he would spend time in the winter. He's from Michigan. He spent time in the winter down in Florida. And he would, he'd make a point of going out with a hat and shirt, right? And his shirt literally said, "Ask me about
I love it.
Izaak Walton." And people would stop him and he'd have these conversations. And, he'd come to these meetings and he'd be talking about how it's just that simple, right? We need to grow the number of people getting involved, do this kind of proactive, simple outreach. And folks like Bob, too, who, among so many of our members, are passionate about the need to continue to be fighting, to protect the environment, to address the challenges today. I mean, the organization's motto is defenders of soil, air, woods, waters, and wildlife. And the founders, they picked defenders for a reason. They looked at the situation then, and to some degree, it was a battle between very different forces, between a force that was looking at the environment as something to profit on, regardless of the impacts, right? And on the other side, frankly, just citizens coming together to say, no, stop. The first issue of the magazine, that first editorial, was entitled "Time to Call a Halt." Right? Time to call a halt to this destructive behavior, this wanton use of the resource for today without any thought to tomorrow. And so I think that's what I think about people like Bob, who were that constant voice of, our work's not over. It's not done. We have more to do. We need to take on these challenges, get more people involved, and we can make a difference.
I love it. I love it. Briefly, before we start to see the landing out in the distance, the magazine, tell us more about that.
Yeah. Flagship publication of the organization from back, I think the first issue was in August of 1922. And really at that time, it was the single most important way to communicate with members all across the country. There were no other members, right? There were no other methods at that point in time. Maybe you sent a letter or something like that. Again, that mass communication to the membership and it doing all the things we're doing in other means now, right? We do action alerts today by sending an email and say, here's where you can go to quickly communicate with your congressman, for example, or
Mhm.
your local state senator. Here in the magazine, clip this out and send it to the president of the United States. And I think over time, right, the issues, the conservation issues of the day covered by the magazine, if there was a major issue, we've no doubt covered it at some point in time. And today, it remains, even though we have so many other means of communication, it's the only thing that goes to all of our members all across the country and reaches all of them. And I think you see that. You have to meet Michael Reinemar, communication director, and he's the managing editor of Outdoor America, is the commitment that remains for the organization to educate our members and hopefully a broader segment of the American people about the pressing conservation issues of the day, highlight some of the things that our chapters are doing, and also ways for folks to get involved. I mean, we have a lot of focus on simple citizen science in the magazine as well, really looking beyond, to an audience beyond just the membership. They can use the tools that we put together with some really, really basic training from us, or maybe no training at all, and make a difference for conservation in their community.
I love it. And I'm imagining you're going to accept a lowly member from Nevada into the fold.
We
Uh,
certainly welcome that. Thank you.
all right. All right. Just checking on that. Michael was a great resource, by the way. So kudos to him. And because for our listeners, it was Michael Reinemeyer that he and I were having dinner at the OWAA conference, and he handed me two magazines, which I almost lost, by the way. But I gave them to a friend of mine to hold because I was going out somewhere and I didn't want to have to go up to the room. But that's a long story. But I got them back, so thank you for that.
Great.
So before we head out, Scott, and I always ask my guests if they wouldn't mind focusing on a couple things. One of them is what we call an insight to go. And perhaps there is you've shared a lot, you've given a lot that we are grateful for today, but is there anything that you would like to leave with our listeners about the work that's being done or they can do, whether it's a quote, a book, an article, or just, you know, your work in the public space and the impact you're having? Anything you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, I sure would. I appreciate that. But I think it's really, I'd come back to this. What I'd say is that anyone can make a positive impact for conservation. That's what I'd leave with folks. And that's what I encourage them to think about. We need that as much as ever. To some degree, there's big issues that kind of dominate the space, right? And things like climate change, for example, it's hard for anyone to get their head around that, right? What impact can you have on an issue like that? But from that to so many other things, water pollution is a perfect example. Litter, the health of the environment in your own community, right? There's simple things you can do to get engaged. And whether you spend an hour, 3 hours, or 3 weeks, where you become the superstar volunteer for another organization, you're making a positive difference, and we need it. We need it. Like we talk about how our conservation problems haven't been solved, they've evolved. That's where we are today. And everyone, the country, and I think, I don't want this to sound, hyperbolic, but ultimately the planet can certainly benefit from just individuals getting involved.
I love it. And a question I occasionally ask, and again, this is borders on the gotcha question, but again, I know you're going to handle this without an issue. Hope, the word hope. Do you have hope?
I certainly do. I certainly do. The problems, the issues out there, they're serious. There's no question about it, right? But in some respects, it's not that solutions aren't knowable. We know what they are. We need to scale them up. Like soil health's another perfect example, right? We know the solution to improve soil health, reduce pollution, make a more sustainable food supply, right? The practices that some farmers are already doing across the country or private landowners are doing. What we've got to do is we've got to go from kind of nibbling around the edges to scaling it up dramatically. And so I think if we can do things like that, we can make a difference. We're seeing a transition. It's a slow one. We're seeing a transition in our economy to a much more clean energy economy. And ultimately we'll get there. And so I do very much have it. We've got hard work ahead. There's no question about it. And in the near term, again, I think you think about things like climate change, there are significant challenges. And certainly you've heard it from the world scientists. They're increasingly telling us it's urgent to act now. We do that, we'll ultimately be able to mitigate the worst effects, and move forward. And I think about too, when you see the pandemic and how people wanted to get outside, right? And
Right.
even though, most Americans are more disconnected from the outdoors than ever before, right? They wanted to go back out and they did. And I think that's another thing, right? Hopeful sign, people back outside, they want to do something and they take that hour or two and that makes a positive difference.
Most definitely. In fact, I moved from Chicago to Las Vegas right at the onset of COVID. And my old car made it. I bought a new car, but my goal was to get out to the desert and see the stars. And I tell you, I can't think of a better place to be in when we're all in lockdown is to get in my car and go out to the desert. So I appreciate that. Scott, before we head out today, if our listeners would like to learn more about the Izaak Walton League of America, where are the best places for them to go?
Yeah, I think the best place to start is our website, iwla.org. And you can find out everything from how do you get involved in simple volunteer science, stream monitoring in your community, or just exploring for, stream bugs with our Creek Critters app, to finding whether or not there may be a chapter close to you. As you indicated, there's not one close to you in Las Vegas. Most of our chapters in kind of Midwest to Great Lakes states into the mid-Atlantic, Maryland and Virginia, for example. But you can find that and you can learn more about any number of issues we're working on. So that's the best place to start.
Okay. And I know you're on some of the social sites like Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. So we will provide not only the website, iwla.org, but also provide backlinks to the social sites as well.
Yeah, that's
Scott, it's
great.
been a
Thank you.
pleasure to have you on the Outdoor Adventure Series podcast. This is like hitting a bullseye. When people ask, why do you do the podcast, Howard? What is Outdoor Adventure Series about? And really, this focus on conservation, stewardship, access and enjoyment, it all comes together in the work that you and the Izaak Walton League of America and all your cadre of volunteers are undertaking. So thank you so much for spending time out of what I know is a busy day because all executive directors are busy, but I really appreciate you taking time and carving out that for us. And again, thanks to Michael for helping to set this up. So we truly appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate the opportunity, Howard, and your interest in us and the opportunity to share a little bit about what the Izaak Walton League of America is doing with your listeners all across the country. Thank you.
Fantastic. All right. Okay, folks, really, this is like hitting the bullseye. I mean, you can't get any better than this. Chatting with Scott Kovarovics, the executive director at the Izaak Walton League of America. If you didn't know what the league is about before, you certainly do now. I know I do. And I definitely want to encourage you to go out to their website, the Izaak Walton League of America's website at iwla.org. And you can find them on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And we're going to provide all the links. But look at the work that they're doing and the impact that they're doing. And my God, 100 years. They're celebrating their 100-year anniversary. And you don't get to be 100 years old if you're not doing something right. Okay. And the impact that they're having. And I would venture to guess, even in your communities, many of the communities across the US, that somebody who knows somebody that knows what the Izaak Walton League of America is all about and the impact that they've been having. And so, again, what a great conversation today with Scott. And as we get to kind of take a really a nice meandering view of not only his background, but what the league is doing, both as a national organization and collaborating with other like-minded organizations, but also what's happening at the chapter level. And I love that story about the member. He just wears his hat and his shirt and just goes out and walks the neighborhood down in Florida when he's in the winter season going down from Michigan. So I totally appreciate that. And so I think, That's a good idea. And so what I'd love, again, let us know what you think of today's episode. Leave us a comment on YouTube or any of our social sites, our website. You can also follow us on the outdooradventureseries.com. That's the website. Facebook and LinkedIn, we have the Outdoor Adventure Series, and we are on all of the podcasting platforms as well as on YouTube. Okay, folks, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, go out there, have a phenomenal day. And we will see you on a future episode of the Outdoor Adventure Series podcast. Take care now.